Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's a bit of an unsettling trend for the Canadian Border Services Agency. Their kiosks going black at some of the country's biggest and busiest airports. The first incident dating back to late September, that one lasting about 2 days. Then a pair of outages in October, followed by the latest service interruption just last week. At what price, though, both economically and in regards to national security, are these system outages costing the country? And what can these back-to-back incidents tell us about the aging infrastructure of government systems and whether or not Ottawa is pouring adequate funding into the real threats against national security? I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to David Shipley, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Beauceron Security, to discuss what exactly is happening at Canadian airports with outage after outage and the reality it forces government agencies to see when it comes to the state of safety in this country. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we've seen 4 Cbsa kiosk outages in just 2 months, the first lasting about 2 days, followed by 3 more incidents. At the broader level, what information do these kiosks, these inspection kiosks, gather when they're in use?
Well, these have really helped speed up the process of people answering the key questions when they're entering our country, whether they're Canadian citizens or visitors to our country. And, it's how we're able to process so many people flying and crossing other border points so efficiently now. And they've been great. And if you have things like a Nexus card, like I do, you can tap your card, take your photo, it fills everything out. It got rid of a ton of paper, sped things up. It's a great system when it works.
So what kind of levels of security when you're at a border crossing via air or land, what kind of levels does the Cbsa kind of implement? You have these kiosks that are at the inspection. What comes next?
Well, the interesting thing with these technologies, first of all, you have to make sure that no one can tamper with them when they're using them. So that takes a lot of work. It's not just like you roll a laptop out and away you go. So there's a lot of thought that goes into the technology and obviously a lot of expense. Then the biggest challenge becomes maintaining connectivity between these kiosks and the systems that actually have access to the vast amount of data. Is this actually David Shipley crossing the border? How often has David been traveling? The things that aid in Cbsa doing its work and its investigation to protect Canadians. And that's critical. And every step you get away from that bleeding edge technology you see, it gets a little creakier and older and harder to maintain. And I genuinely believe Cbsa when they've communicated publicly that these outages are not a cyber-related incident. If they were a cyber-related incident, typically you would see the nasty ransom note on the screen. You would see transparency from government in admitting it, etc. This may be, however, something a little bit even more disturbing than just a hacktivist taking over airport terminal signs. This is showing the age of the critical infrastructure we depend on. And it's so hard to get it updated and to maintain it the further you go back into the older and older systems.
Now, the president of the Cbsa, admitted that these are legacy systems in use here. Candidly speaking, does that just mean they're old and not modernized?
Yeah, it means they can be incredibly old. They could be 20, 30 years old, which is, almost ancient history in technology, but not uncommon. A lot of Canadians don't realize when the pandemic hit and the government had to be agile and roll out changes to employment insurance or roll out the CERB program in general, it was a near miracle they found programmers who could still update government systems to do those things. And literally those people are retiring out, or in some cases are no longer with us. So the human knowledge to update some of these systems. And you might be thinking, well, David, why didn't we keep up with these systems? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, everyone hates changing. Once you get a government system up and running, it's not like government ever shuts down. The border runs 24/7. It's a great example of how do you replace something. It's an analogy that we often use in tech is you have to build the plane, get the plane in the air, and then upgrade the plane while you're flying. And that's really, really hard. Secondly, it's expensive. And, no politician gets reelected for a new data center or a new government application. They want to cut ribbons on bridges or hospitals or new programs like, breakfast programs for kids or other things. Nobody gets excited about IT, but we depend on it. And third, there is a lot of fear in Ottawa about IT systems. Everything from the failure of the long gun registry to the Phoenix Pay debacle, which was less about tech and more about how tech is managed as a change inside government, to obviously the border app and all of the controversy around that. So it's one of those interesting wicked problems where it's a really tough tech problem. It's really critical business issue that we have to keep running, and it's a political nightmare.
When these systems were down, airports, as you said, had to get back to the manual, old-fashioned inspections by border personnel, which that's not useless, but it's definitely not as efficient and meticulous as these online systems. Although they are dated, it's still not as meticulous. When we're using border agents, what size of a lapse in data would you say is not being collected?
So I don't think that we lose information, because when you think about the paper forms, and I've traveled so much over the last 30 years, both when I was in the military and in civilian life, that I remember filling everything out, and it's the same on the computer screens. We really haven't changed the information we're collecting. What we're changing is the ability to access and use that information in real time to make those decisions. And then you're relying more on the Cbsa agents and others to pick up on abnormalities. So, it does potentially increase risk of non-compliance with laws or other things, or maybe people getting up to shenanigans they shouldn't be. But the reality is the biggest friction point when these systems go down is everything slows down like molasses on a Canadian winter, right? Like it's just goes to a crawl. And of course, when we talk about airports, what does that mean? Well, if you've got a connecting flight, bad news for you. If those systems go down, and, because the border agents aren't just going to just like wave people through, they're going to go through the right process. They're trained law enforcement individuals, and they care about the safety of Canadians. So they're going to do the work. It's just going to take them 10 times longer.
Right. You talked about how much slower this makes the process. When we saw that first outage at the end of September, you would see these trucks, at these land crossings just idle for hours trying to get through the border. I wonder what kind of costs are these outages posing for Canadians, economically speaking, you'd say.
Well, yeah, I mean the order of magnitude. Let's start with the land border crossings, right? So you've got billions of dollars of goods that are moving across the Canadian-U.S. border, particularly prior to the shenanigans around the deconstruction of our integrated economies with respect to tariffs. And that's an added nightmare on that side. Which, by the way, in terms of Canadian reaction to things and how we're dealing with things, we rely on these digital systems to help us respond to these challenges that are imposed on us. So that's where the billions start adding up. And then you get into the tens of millions of dollars when you talk about all the impacts on flight passengers, maybe having to get extra hotels or rebook their flights or other things. And then there's the incalculable amount of stress that we're inflicting on Canadians and on the people that run our airports, that are at the staffing of these things. And that comes at a cost too. And in Cbsa, when these kind of systems go down, we're not always kind to the folks trying to protect us at the airport. And, we're tired and we're stressed. And I completely get this. I've as you were mentioning, I just came back from a very intense multi-stop trip through LA to Toronto to Montreal to another city in New Brunswick, and then a drive. But I always try and remember that the people on the other side are trying to do their best too. And I think if there's one thing, we all need to be a little bit more resilient emotionally, the tech fails. It fails a lot. In fact, it's a miracle it doesn't fail more often. It is so infinitely complex and becoming more complex every single day. It's held together with bubblegum, tears, and the prayers of information technology professionals. This stuff is not immortal. It is not infallible. It is built by people that put their pants on just like you and I. And they make mistakes.
Right. That there is that human grace aspect of this, of this whole situation. You mentioned that, we are severely outdated here in Canada with some of our border technology and the systems that are being used. Is there another country that's using a system that Canada should look towards as a model for their future systems?
I don't believe there's anyone who's doing it any better. They all have the exact same problem of they built the plane, they got the plane in the air, and they have to maintain the plane while it's flying. So that's a common business pressure for all of them. I don't think that there's an example in, the US government that they're that much further ahead of us. There's there. And to be clear, this technology debt that we have in government is far bigger than just the border agency. It's what we see most often, but people would be terrified at how archaic the information systems that are crucial to the running of government. When we think about the Canada Revenue Agency, when we think about how government makes decisions for policy and gathers information and other things that they do, it's awful. And it's not a problem. We are willing to spend the time, the political capital, or the cash. When we're looking at the budget that was just passed, look at all the things that we have to do without taking more from Canadians at a point where they can't afford anything right now. So we're digging ourselves into massive debts to refund our military, for example. So no one from the IT department is going to be knocking on the Prime Minister's door and saying, by the way, we have a $20 billion tech debt that you need to pay for, and it's not going to be well received when the military has come through, when we still have to maintain the quality and expectations for social programs, when the provinces are lining up for all the federal money they can get. IT always ends up like that poor orphan, please, sir, could I have some more? And then we're shocked when things break.
One of Prime Minister Carney's campaign promises earlier this year was to hire 1,000 more border personnel, 80% of those being armed officers, 20% being intelligence personnel and security. Those 1,000 positions haven't been filled yet. But I want to ask you if the investment of border personnel is the right one, considering, as you said, we have these outdated systems and IT is always the last to get its investment. Do you think the money should be poured into border security technologies instead?
I think from my perspective, and keep in mind, so, I look at this as a cybersecurity professional. I look at it as a former reporter that interviewed politicians and others and covered campaigns. And, as a Canadian citizen, the world security environment has changed. That's very, very clear. And it's not just this ongoing tension with the United States. All of the other risks, all the other people around the world who would wish to cause Canadians harm are still out there. And then, of course, we have this scourge of drug trafficking. And, I'm not concerned about the infinitesimally small amount of drugs that flow from Canada to the United States. I'm deeply concerned of the tragedies we see in Canadian towns and cities across the country. And so our border agency is on the front line of that, and great. And, we gutted in the 1990s during the time of austerity, the last big generation. We gutted things like port security and border security, and we cashed in on the dividend of what we thought were the good times of the 90s and the 2000s, and they were. And you look back now and realize how lucky we were. But the bills come due. So I do think those are necessary. I do think we have the right resources in general. You talk about government, you're at almost 300,000 people. So I do think we have the people to do things. I don't think we can fix all of the things all of the time. I would say one thing that we do need to fix is procurement. And this is not the coolest thing to say. It's like, oh, what do you mean? How? If you buy as your sole goal the lowest bidder's product, shockingly, you don't get great products. So maybe we need to revisit this. And I think the Prime Minister, to his credit, has expressed, and others in through the Treasury have said, okay, wait a second. Maybe we became so focused on this one narrow definition of the public good. Make sure someone's cousin wasn't in getting some extra cash from this deal, which remains important. But maybe we need to make sure we're buying really good fit for purpose technology. And maybe, just maybe, Canadians can make it. And yes, we can.
You mentioned that that's very small flow of drugs from Canada into the U.S. You mentioned how people, just at the local level, being victims of highly sophisticated, cyber attacks and these meticulous criminals. In your opinion, what do you think is the biggest threat to Canadian national security at this point in time?
Oh, yeah. I would say, honestly, the biggest threat to Canadian national security is that we still don't take the threats that are against us seriously. If you ask Canadians about where the world is, and you're going to hear pocketbooks, and you're going to hear about taxes, and you're going to hear about healthcare and all the things we always talk about. We're in the greatest period of armed conflict around the world that we have seen in almost 100 years. You've got an active land war in Europe. You've got the Americans itching to start something up with Venezuela. They parked one of their biggest aircraft carriers off the coast of that, and they have illegally killed scores of people in 20 different attacks in international waters for legally dubious grounds. This is weird times. So we need to step up, and we need to recognize that. And then the second part is we need government to act. And one of the things that I'm deeply concerned about is, on the whole, government spends an enormous amount of money relative to, what Canadians would think about, on actually keeping itself secure. Hundreds of millions of dollars per year to protect the core castle. And they do a great job, particularly when you see the world of threats that are absolutely pummeling at the doors of that castle. Unfortunately, as in medieval times, us serfs don't live inside the castle. We live around the castle, and we are getting pillaged nonstop. And the number one threat to Canadians in terms of their security right now, nationally, is fraud. Facebook was just, called out by a phenomenal investigative journalism review by Reuters that 10% of their global revenue, up to $16 billion, they knew was fraud. And they made that money off of the ads. And so, you look at the losses from Canadians, there's $600 million in reported fraud to the National Anti-Fraud Center. That's only, at best, 10% of what actually went down. It could even be worse. So there may be $6 billion in losses in fraud. So our border, this whole idea of trying to protect ourselves is important, but online, it's non-existent. And we ran headlong into this concept of an information superhighway. And I live in the province that was the furthest ahead of anybody in this country. We had a phenomenal premier, Frank McKenna, went on to become Canada's ambassador to the US. But no one stopped to think, hey, if we're building a highway, are there going to be highway robbers? And turns out, yeah, a lot of them. So how we deal with that, and the reason I bring this up in the sense of national security, is that money flows out of the country, and it doesn't just go to kids in hoodies living in basements around the world. It goes into the pocketbooks of hostile nation states. North Korea funds its nuclear weapons program off the back of stealing cryptocurrency and other cybercrime. Russia funds some of its economy through the hard-earned cash, hard-earned, of cybercrime. So the world is becoming more hostile. Transnational organized criminal gangs use this money for human trafficking, weapons, and the drugs they try and bring back across our border. So it all kind of full circles back to this. Online, offline, the bills just keep piling up. I feel like we're that single parent family that's just trying to make do, and all we see is the debt being dug in. But the reality is that's just where we are as a country right now. It's not that the bills are going to go away. They're not. And no one's coming to pay for them anymore. I think that's the biggest thing that Canadians have to realize, is that Trump is not an abnormality when you look at the frustration of the American taxpayer. And they looked around the world to social programs in Europe and in Canada that they essentially funded with their national security spending. And then they said, enough. And when you see Trump in that light, all of a sudden you realize, yeah, I'd be pretty mad if we were paying for other people's security as well. And the bill isn't cheap.
My follow-up to that, you mentioning that fraud is such a huge threat to Canadian security. Is that what Ottawa is putting their time into tackling? We just had the budget tabled. Are the resources being put into protecting Canadians at that level?
So we're starting to see, some interest. Because I'll be honest, we were not. And in particular, one of the things that was incredibly frustrating was when this whole thing blew up with Trump and we decided to play security theatrics by leasing Black Hawk helicopters and made sure we took selfie videos and watched them fly overhead and did all of that. Look, we're stopping the non-existent drug threat from Canada. Cool. I get what we were trying to do there. I think it was a bad idea, but sure. We took money from the RCMP to fund that. And it came out of, you'll often hear this, and we found efficiencies and we haven't harmed frontline policing. Like, get you the anti-fraud, the IT infrastructure that helps respond to the calls. That's what they mean they cut. So, yes, the officers in the street didn't disappear. They have a massive recruitment gap, so that's a different issue. But they've gutted their capacity. In fact, the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre had budget cuts for the last 2 years. They've had fewer resources despite scams going through the roof. So on the positive side, in the budget, we heard the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister talk about a new financial crimes agency, which is interesting, a new coordinating agency. I'm crossing my fingers. Some really smart detectives I know in our Toronto Police Service and others, they were really, really genuinely excited about some of these announcements. And, these are folks who have been working some of the most heinous scams you could imagine, that have wiped out seniors' life savings, that have taken advantage of people who are, at the depths of loneliness, and they're doing great work. So to see these folks who have seen the worst have some hope, I take some solace in that. We'll see if they back it up with the money. Again, the long list of people hitting up Uncle Mark for cash right now in Canada is not small. So we'll see if they back it up. And the big problem for them will be how we resource policing was designed for crime from an entirely different era. You've got policing deserts in this country where you have small cities like my city, Fredericton. It doesn't have the tax base to have a Toronto police size specialist team in cyber. And so your response, the level of justice you get in a small town in Canada, is not as good as a big city. And how is that Canadian or fair? So how are we resourcing? And maybe we also need a different kind of cop. That's one thing that I've been really talking a lot about. We don't need cyber cops that need to be trained on personal weapons. They're not running the streets, attacking the gangs. Guess what? We have other really well-trained cops that can do the door kicking in when the doors need to get kicked in. We need ones that can work an Excel spreadsheet, that know how to read code, that can, follow the money in new ways. We need a different kind of cop for a different kind of crime. It's really telling. When I was a crime reporter 20 years ago, there were still bank robberies. When was the last time you heard of a bank robbery in Canada? Right? It's not because crime went away. It's because they went to us, the customers. We're getting robbed now every single day.
Oh, what a note. Our last question that I want to ask you, David, if an outage happens for a fifth time, what kind of conversations do you expect the CBSA and Ottawa to be having?
I would love to see them having these conversations without an outage. I think the only way that they can rebuild trust, but also build the political support they need for the investments they need to have, is to be transparent to the right parliamentary committees to say, here's the root cause of the failure. We've got these outdated systems. We need this much of investment, and we need this much tolerance for some of the changes we need to make. Can we actually get the support across party lines in a minority parliament to invest in the things that Canadians expect to just work? But the reality is the digital plumbing for Ottawa that we all depend on is leaking. And the more it leaks, the more damage it causes, and it can get really bad. And that fragility can be more than just a delayed trip to Cancun. It can be billions of dollars at the border of goods that we're not getting through. It can be mass chaos along the line, and we need to be more resilient. And that's not just about this. We saw attacks on airports where a hacktivist group, and these guys weren't even that good. They got onto 3 airports, I think, in Canada and 1 in the US, and they displayed some pro-terrorism messages on there, and it demonstrated that we're just not taking critical security seriously. So we need to see Ottawa pass legislation that almost every other G7 country has done that says, here's some bare minimum cyber fire code standards that we think energy transmission, that transportation, that our telecommunications and banking sector should have. That's security. Right now, it's stuck in another parliamentary committee. I've been fighting for this for 3+ years to finally get the law passed so we could have some standards, so maybe the lights stay on. CBSA is a canary in the coal mine of the actual problem. We see it because people feel it so viscerally when it happens. There's all kinds of stuff that we're not seeing the water drips in the pipes right now. And if it all catastrophically grinds out, what if we can't file our taxes next year? What impact does that have to people getting timely benefits? You're talking about millions of people all of a sudden who maybe not get the OAS or other things because the whole thing finally just crashed out and they don't have the staffing. They're going to cut, a 10% of the civil service. So they're not going to have the people around to build that resiliency. They need that IT to pull off the right sizing of the civil service. So I think it's a great moment. We've squandered a lot of these great moments in the past. So hopefully we do not squander the opportunity for this. And if we walk away just thinking CBSA bad and incompetent and we miss the story. They're really good. You think about the millions of people that move across our border and the goods. Like that, it's a miracle how well that works. But there's a cry for help here. And if we don't hear it, we're part of the problem too.
All right, David Shipley, we're going to leave it on that very, very powerful note. Thank you so much for this interesting conversation today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
And that was The Big Story. If you have thoughts on this conversation, be sure to share them with us. You can find us on X at The Big Story FPN or by email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Be sure to share this episode with someone you think may find it interesting. You can get The Big Story every weekday on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.